A cart lies abandoned in a narrow street, its horse gone. From the houses nearby, you hear a sound that is not quite a cough and not quite a scream. This is Europe in the 1340s, and something has arrived that does not belong in any world. We know it as the Black Death, but the true story is far stranger than any textbook summary. This is a historical detective story, and we are going to follow the trail beyond the bacteria into the hidden realms of esoteric belief and occult panic that truly reshaped our world. By the end, you will understand how a single disease didn't just kill people, it fundamentally altered human consciousness, shattered ancient power structures, and rewired the very soul of the West. We will trace its path from mysterious origins whispered in trading ports to its apocalyptic conclusion that left survivors questioning reality itself. What secret knowledge was pursued in the shadow of the grave? How did rituals of blood and prayer attempt to fight a horror no one could see? The answers lie in a forgotten layer of history where science, superstition, and spirituality collided. What do you think happens when an entire civilization stares directly into the abyss? The disease arrived not with a declaration of war, but on a merchant ship. In the autumn of 1347, a fleet of Genoese trading vessels limped into the port of Messina, Sicily. The sailors were already dying. Witnesses described them as carrying a mysterious sickness in their bones, a sickness that manifested in terrifying and unmistakable ways. First came the fever, a burning heat that left victims shivering and delirious. Then the most infamous sign, the buboes, swollen lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, or neck that grew to the size of apples, turning a livid purple or black before erupting with pus and blood. This was the bubonic plague. For others, the infection went septic, spreading through the bloodstream and causing dark, bruise-like splotches to bloom across the skin before death came within hours. This was the even deadlier septicemic plague, and in its most horrifying form, the pneumonic plague, the bacteria attacked the lungs, turning coughs into bloody sprays that could infect anyone standing nearby, killing with terrifying speed. The people of Messina watched in horror, then did the only thing they could think to do. They drove the ships and the dying men back out to sea. It was already far too late. The seeds of this catastrophe had been sown years earlier, far to the east at a trading post called Caffa on the Black Sea. There, in 1346, a Mongol army besieging the city was itself ravaged by a strange new illness. In a desperate and brutal act of biological warfare, the Mongol commander ordered the corpses of his own dead soldiers to be catapulted over the city walls. The Genoese traders trapped inside fled Caffa by sea, carrying with them not just silks and spices, but the unseen contagion in their blood and in the fleas on their rats. From there, the plague rode the superhighways of the medieval world, the trade routes, moving from port to port with terrifying efficiency, from Constantinople to Alexandria, from Marseille to London. But to understand the sheer panic that followed, you must first understand the world it invaded. Medieval Europe had no concept of germs, no understanding of bacteria or viral transmission. Medicine was not a science, it was a philosophy based on the ancient teachings of Galen. The body, they believed, was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Sickness was simply an imbalance of these fluids. A physician might treat the buboes by applying a poultice of dried toad or by bleeding a patient to rebalance their humors, actions we now know would only hasten death. Diagnosis was often tied to astrology, to the alignment of planets believed to influence the body's fluids. So when a disease appeared that caused such grotesque and rapid decay that killed rich and poor, pious and sinner alike without any discernible pattern, the entire framework of understanding shattered. This was not an imbalance, it was an eradication. The physical horror of the symptoms was bad enough, but the true terror was metaphysical. If this wasn't a sickness of the body's humors, then what was it? The only logical answer in a world steeped in faith was that it was a sickness of the soul, a punishment from God, or perhaps the work of something far darker. The biological event had instantly become a spiritual crisis, and a society armed only with leeches and prayers was about to face its greatest trial. The plague was not one monster, but three. Each form was a distinct manifestation of the same bacterium, Yersinia pestis, and together they acted like a grim trinity of destruction. The most common, and the one that gave the pandemic its name, was the bubonic plague. Here, the bacteria entered through a flea bite and traveled via the body's lymphatic system. Think of this system as a network of backroads and highways your immune system uses to patrol for invaders. The bacteria would ride this network until they reached a major lymph node, a kind of immune checkpoint, usually in the groin, armpit, or neck. There, they would set up a fortress, multiplying wildly. The body's desperate defense would cause the node to swell into a painful, egg-sized lump called a bubo, which would darken to a horrific black or purple as the tissue died inside. This form killed roughly 60% of its victims, a staggering number, but it was not directly contagious from person to person. The real vector was the humble flea. When a flea bit an infected rat, it ingested the bacteria, which multiplied so prolifically in the flea's gut that it created a blockage. The starving, frantic flea would then jump to a human and bite repeatedly, each time regurgitating thousands of bacteria directly into the new host's bloodstream. The rat was merely the reservoir, the flea was the delivery system, but when those bacteria bypassed the lymphatic highway and entered the lungs directly, the disease transformed into something far more efficient and deadly, the pneumonic plague. This could happen if someone developed a secondary lung infection from the bubonic form, or catastrophically, if they inhaled the bacteria from the cough of another pneumonic plague victim. This turned a human being into the vector. The symptoms were brutal: a devastating pneumonia with high fever, chest pain, and a cough that produced a bloody, frothy sputum teeming with bacteria. A single breath in the wrong room could be a death sentence. The mortality rate for pneumonic plague, without modern antibiotics, was nearly 100%, with death often coming in less than 48 hours. It was the ultimate biological weapon, spreading on the air itself. The third and rarest horseman was the septicemic plague. This was a systemic overload where the bacteria flooded directly into the bloodstream, often from a flea bite near a major blood vessel. The body's defenses were completely overwhelmed. There were no buboes here, just a rapid, overwhelming poisoning. The bacteria would cause widespread clotting, leading to gangrene in the extremities, fingers, toes, and noses turning black and necrotic. Dark bruise-like splotches, called petechiae, would appear all over the skin. Death could be shockingly fast, sometimes within a single day. This was the plague operating at its most vicious, a silent, internal storm that left little time for prayer or panic. This was the tangible, biological horror, a perfectly adapted pathogen with multiple avenues of attack. Yet, for the people living through it, this scientific reality was invisible. All they saw were the symptoms: the blackened limbs, the coughing fits, the sudden collapses, without the microscope to reveal the tiny, rod-shaped bacterium or the understanding of flea ecology. The only frameworks left to explain such a precise, multifaceted scourge were divine judgment or demonic witchcraft. The stage was now set for the true unraveling as a society, armed only with faith and fear, began its desperate search for a cause and a cure in the unseen world. But to see the plague only as a biological event is to miss the deeper story. The ground was already poisoned long before the first ship reached Messina. Europe in the early 1300s was a continent under immense strain, caught in a tightening vice of environmental and social collapse. The first squeeze came from the sky. A period now called the Little Ice Age had begun, a climatic shift bringing colder, wetter summers and brutally long winters. Crops failed, harvests rotted in the fields, and the growing season shrank. This wasn't just a few bad years, it was a fundamental change in the very rhythm of life that agriculture depended on. Then, between 1315 and 1317, this climatic stress erupted into full-blown catastrophe, the Great Famine. For 3 consecutive years, relentless rains and cold devastated grain production across Northern Europe. The price of food skyrocketed. People ate their seed grain, then their farm animals, then they resorted to foraging for roots, bark, and grass. Chroniclers of the time wrote of desperate peasants abandoning their children and of widespread cannibalism. Malnutrition on such a scale did more than cause immediate suffering. It fundamentally weakened an entire generation's immune systems, making them far more susceptible to the diseases that would follow. At the same time, the political landscape was fracturing. In 1337, the Hundred Years' War began between England and France, a sprawling conflict of chevauchés where armies lived off the land by burning and looting the countryside. This constant warfare displaced populations, destroyed food supplies, and funneled masses of stressed, hungry people into crowded towns and cities, the perfect breeding grounds for contagion. So picture the scene by the 1340s, a population already physically diminished by hunger, crammed into unsanitary urban centers, with social order strained by the chaos of war. This was the tinder. The conventional historical narrative rightly points to this as the perfect storm, a confluence of famine, climate change, and war that primed Europe for a demographic disaster. But this explanation, while crucial, remains on the surface. It tells us why the plague was so devastating in scale, but it does nothing to explain the peculiar shape of the terror that followed, the specific nightmares that haunted the survivors. For that, we must look beyond weakened bodies and toward shattered minds, beyond the material world, and into the spiritual panic that truly defined the experience of the Black Death. Because when the dying began, people did not just blame the weather or the wars. They searched for a meaning, a culprit they could comprehend, and their gaze turned inward toward their neighbors and upward toward the heavens. The sky for medieval Europe was not empty space, it was a living text. Every star, every planet, was a divine character in a celestial story that directly dictated events on Earth. This was not mere superstition, it was the cutting-edge science of the age, as rigorous and respected as astronomy is today. So when the plague began its grim march, the most learned men in Europe did not look for fleas or rats, they looked up. And what they saw confirmed their deepest fears. In March of 1345, 2 full years before the ships reached Messina, a rare and terrifying celestial event occurred. The 3 slowest moving and most malevolent planets, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, moved into a tight conjunction in the sign of Aquarius. To the astrologers of the University of Paris, commissioned by the King of France to explain the catastrophe, this alignment was the undeniable root cause. Their official pronouncement, a document that carried the weight of absolute authority, stated clearly that the conjunction had corrupted the air itself. Saturn, cold and dry, brought a chilling, deathly influence. Jupiter, while often benevolent, could amplify whatever it touched. Mars, hot and angry, injected violence and fever. Their combined power in Aquarius, a sign linked to the air and to sudden, revolutionary change, created a poisonous miasma, a deadly corruption of the very atmosphere people breathe. This was the miasma theory, the dominant medical explanation for centuries. Disease was not caused by tiny organisms, but by foul air, by rotting smells, by vapors rising from swamps or from piles of the unburied dead. The planetary conjunction was seen as the ultimate source of this global miasma, a cosmic pollution event. It made perfect, terrifying sense. The plague was in the air, you could smell it in the stench of the dying cities, and now the scholars had proven it was written in the stars themselves. This belief dictated the response. Physicians attending the sick wore bizarre beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs and flowers, not to filter bacteria, but to ward off the bad air with stronger, purer scents. Fires were lit in the streets, not for warmth, but because the smoke was thought to cleanse the atmosphere. People carried pouches of sweet-smelling spices, believing the fragrance created a protective bubble of good air around them. The entire public health strategy was built on combating an astrological event. This perspective reveals a crucial truth for them: the plague was not a random accident of biology. It was a scheduled disaster, a fated event decreed by the mechanics of the heavens. It provided a cold, logical comfort, a reason for the unreasoning horror. If the stars caused it, then perhaps the stars could also end it. This search for a cosmic logic, for a pattern in the chaos, would soon twist and turn inward as fear began to seek a human face for the celestial curse. Yet this celestial poison was only one layer of a deeper corruption. If the stars wrote the message, the very substance of the world delivered it. Medieval and ancient thinkers believed the universe was not just matter and void, but was saturated with a living, breathing energy. The Greeks called it pneuma, the breath of life. Alchemists and mystics spoke of the aether, a fifth element beyond earth, air, fire, and water, a pure and subtle spirit that connected all things and carried the vital force of creation itself. This aether was the medium through which the stars influenced the earth, the invisible river of fate and health. In the esoteric view, the plague was more than a disease, it was a physical symptom of a spiritual sickness infecting this world's soul. The poisonous miasma from the stars didn't just dirty the air, it corrupted the aether itself. Think of it like this: if the aether is a clear, flowing stream that nourishes all life, then the Great Conjunction poured a vial of spiritual toxin directly into its source. The stream turned brackish and deadly. This corruption then manifested physically in the bodies of men and women as the swelling buboes and the blackened skin, a visible sign of an invisible decay. But what had made the world so vulnerable to this poisoning? The answer, for many, lay in human failing. A society already strained by famine and war was seen as spiritually rotten, ripe for divine retribution. Human sin, greed, heresy, and corruption were thought to have thickened and polluted the aether, making it a receptive host for the celestial plague. Some went further, whispering of a deliberate magical attack. In a world where belief in sorcery was absolute, was it so far-fetched that a powerful cabal or a lone, malevolent sorcerer could weaponize this corrupted energy, directing the poisoned aether toward their enemies? This idea transforms the plague from a natural disaster into a kind of supernatural warfare, an attack on the soul of civilization itself. This belief directly informed the desperate responses. If the world's vital energy was sick, then it needed to be purified. This is where we see the overlap with alchemy, the mystical precursor to chemistry. Alchemy was not merely about turning lead into gold, it was a spiritual science of transformation and purification. The alchemical process of putrefactio, the blackening and decay of base matter, was a necessary step before enlightenment and rebirth. The plague, in its horrific putrefaction of the body, was seen by some adepts as a monstrous, forced putrefactio on a global scale, a terrible but necessary cleansing of a corrupt world. The ringing of church bells during the plague took on a dual meaning. Yes, they called people to prayer, but bells were also believed to purify the air and shatter harmful magical energies, to clear the corrupted aether. The burning of aromatic herbs was not just about sweet smells, it was an attempt to alchemically transform the poisoned atmosphere with the elemental power of fire and the essence of pure plants. Every attempted cure was, on some level, an esoteric ritual to heal the world's broken spirit. Fear needed a face and terror demanded a target. When the stars themselves seemed hostile and the very air felt poisoned, the human mind, craving control, could not accept a faceless enemy. It began with whispers in the crowded, stinking streets, whispers that hardened into accusations. Someone must be doing this, someone with malice in their heart and poison in their hand. The first and most devastating target became the Jewish communities of Europe, isolated by faith, often living in separate quarters, and sometimes working as moneylenders due to Christian prohibitions on usury. They were the perfect outsiders. A monstrous conspiracy theory took root, spreading faster than the disease itself, the lie that Jews were poisoning the wells. This was not presented as a simple crime, but as a dark, ritualistic act. It was said they gathered at night, conspiring with Muslim leaders or with the devil himself, to create poisons from the hearts of basilisks, the flesh of frogs, and stolen communion wafers, then casting this mixture into the public wells to kill Christendom. The accusation carried the chilling logic of occult symbolism. Water, the source of life, was being magically corrupted at its source by a hidden, malevolent priesthood. It made a twisted sense to a population that believed in the power of sacraments and curses. If the plague was a spiritual poison in the aether, then surely someone was brewing its physical counterpart. The results were pogroms of unimaginable horror. Entire Jewish communities in cities like Strasbourg, Mainz, and Basel were rounded up. They were given a grotesque choice: convert to Christianity or die. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, who refused were burned alive in massive pyres, their possessions confiscated by the town or by local lords eager to erase their debts. In some towns, every single Jewish man, woman, and child was exterminated. Lepers, already feared and segregated from society, were accused alongside them, as were foreigners, beggars, and Roma travelers, anyone who could be labeled as not belonging. This was more than simple prejudice run amok. It was a sacrificial ritual on a continental scale. The medieval mind understood the concept of a scapegoat, an entity upon which the sins and impurities of the community could be loaded and then driven out or destroyed, thereby restoring purity. The burning of the Jews was not just an act of hatred, it was a desperate, collective exorcism. By ritually destroying the perceived source of the magical poison, the people believed they were cleansing their world, cutting out the infected tissue of their society to save the whole. They were attempting to perform a surgery on reality itself, offering a human sacrifice to appease a wrathful God and halt the celestial punishment. This reveals the deep, occult undercurrent of the crisis. The plague was fought not just with medicine or prayer, but with blood magic, with the belief that the spilling of one kind of blood could stanch the flow of another. It was a tragedy of epic proportions, born from a magical worldview confronting an invisible horror, and it left a scar on the European soul that would never fully heal. Yet, even as the fires of hatred burned, another group was forming, one that would channel this same desperate energy in a radically different and strangely theatrical direction. From the ashes of burning Jewish quarters rose a different kind of fire, one turned inward. While mobs sought external scapegoats, a new movement offered a terrifying alternative: the idea that salvation lay not in destroying others, but in destroying the self. They called themselves the flagellants, and they became the plague's most dramatic and disturbing living ritual. They did not pray in churches, they marched in the open, a grim parade of penitents moving from town to town. Their ranks swelled with the desperate, from peasants to nobles, all united by a single, shocking belief that by ritually punishing their own flesh, they could absorb the wrath of God and end the plague. This was not quiet devotion, it was public, apocalyptic theater designed to alter cosmic fate. A typical procession was a spectacle of controlled horror. Hundreds of men and sometimes separate groups of women would march into a town, their heads covered in hoods, their robes marked with red crosses on the front and back. They would form a circle in the public square, and to the haunting chant of hymns about sin and the end times, they would begin the ceremony. Each man carried a whip, a flagellum, typically a wooden handle with 3 or 4 leather tails, each tail tipped with sharp iron knots. To the rhythmic chanting, they would beat their own backs, shoulders, and chests in a synchronized frenzy. The blows were not symbolic, they were brutal, drawing blood that would soak their robes and spray the ground around them. The ritual followed a strict 33-day cycle, mirroring the years of Christ's life, a period during which they were forbidden to bathe, shave, or speak with women, even their own wives. They lived in a state of extreme purity and pain, believing their blood was mingling spiritually with the blood of Christ, creating a potent sacrifice to cleanse a sinful world. In their theology, the Church's sacraments had failed, the priests were corrupt, and only this extreme, direct physical atonement could appease a furious God. They were performing a massive, collective act of sympathetic magic, using the pain and blood of their bodies as the ultimate offering to stop the celestial punishment raining down as plague. Their leaders claimed to possess divine letters found on altars or delivered by angels that commanded this practice and promised it would end the suffering. For a terrified populace, the flagellants offered a powerful, visceral answer. They were not victims, they were warriors, fighting the plague on the spiritual battlefield with the only weapons they believed could work: ritualized pain and public purity. They drew huge, hopeful crowds wherever they went, with locals often joining the processions, seeing them as living saints. But this power was precisely what made them dangerous. The flagellant movement was, in essence, a grassroots, mobile church with its own rites and revelations, operating entirely outside the control of Rome. They were bypassing priests, bypassing confession, claiming a direct line to divine forgiveness through their own blood. This was a heresy that struck at the very heart of the Church's authority. Initially tolerant, the papacy soon realized the threat. If people believed they could save themselves through this bloody ritual, what need did they have for the Church, for its sacraments, for its priests? In 1349, Pope Clement VI issued a bull condemning the flagellants, ordering their suppression. Local rulers, who also feared the destabilizing mobs of fanatics, complied. The movement was violently broken up, its leaders executed, its public ceremonies banned. The flagellants vanished almost as quickly as they had appeared, but their brief, shocking rise reveals a profound truth about the plague years. When institutional power and traditional faith seemed powerless, people did not simply give up, they invented new, radical forms of spirituality. They engaged in what they saw as high-stakes occult engineering, attempting to use the physics of pain and sacrifice to bend the will of God itself. It was a desperate, logical response in a world where the rules had shattered, proving that the crisis was not just in the body, but in the very structures of belief that held society together. The art that emerged from the plague years was not meant to comfort, but to confront. In the silent spaces of churches and on the margins of prayer books, a new and haunting figure began to appear, a grinning, animated skeleton. This was the danse macabre, the dance of death, and it became the defining visual symbol of the post-plague world. On the surface, these paintings and woodcuts were simple moral lessons, a procession where death, as a skeleton, takes by the hand a series of figures from every walk of life: emperor, pope, knight, merchant, peasant, and child, leading them all in a final, equalizing dance toward the grave. The message was clear: your wealth, your title, your piety, none of it spares you. Death is the great leveler, but to see this only as a morbid reminder of mortality is to miss its deeper, esoteric function. This was alchemy in visual form. Remember the alchemical process, putrefactio, the necessary blackening and decay that precedes transformation. The dance macabre was society undergoing a collective putrefactio. The skeletal figure of death was not just a destroyer, he was an initiator, a guide, forcibly stripping away the false identities of social rank, wealth, and pride to reveal the bare, universal truth beneath the naked soul. Each figure in the dance is caught in a moment of recognition, a confrontation with their own shadow. In Jungian terms, the shadow is the part of the psyche we reject or ignore, our hidden fears, vulnerabilities, and base mortality. The plague forced every single person, from the palace to the hovel, to stare directly into that shadow. There was no hiding from it. The art ritualized this confrontation, making it a public, shared meditation. You were meant to look at the painting of the proud king being led away by the skeleton and think, that is me. My crown is an illusion. My body will decay. This was the ultimate memento mori, a Latin phrase meaning remember you must die. But it was more than a reminder, it was an active spiritual practice. By consciously meditating on the inevitability of your own death, by dancing with the skeleton in your mind, you were supposed to shed your earthly attachments and focus on the only thing that truly mattered, the salvation of your soul. This was the transformation, the alchemical gold, that could emerge from the black putrefaction of the plague. It fueled a massive inward turn, a surge of personal piety and introspection. If death could come at any moment, in the middle of a sentence, in your sleep, then your relationship with God could no longer be mediated solely by a corrupt priest or a routine Sunday Mass. It had to be immediate, personal, and constant. This psychological shift is what truly began to break the medieval mind. The rigid feudal hierarchy, the idea that God had fixed everyone in their station from king to serf, was shattered by the skeleton's impartial hand. How could you believe in a divinely ordained social order when a pope died screaming in Avignon no differently than a beggar died in a London alley? The dance declared their souls equal in the eyes of eternity. This erosion of blind faith in authority, both earthly and ecclesiastical, planted the seeds for everything that would follow: the Renaissance focus on the individual, the Reformation's challenge to the church, even the slow march toward modern secular thought. The Danse Macabre was the plague's lasting spell, a visual incantation that forever changed how Europe saw itself, not as an unchanging pyramid of power, but as a fragile procession of equals, all holding hands with the same silent partner. The clergy died at a rate that shocked the faithful. They were the spiritual physicians, the ones who administered last rites, who heard final confessions, and who were in constant, intimate contact with the dying. In doing their duty, they perished in staggering numbers. In some regions, over half the priests succumbed. This created a catastrophic shortage, leaving terrified communities without sacraments, without comfort, and without a conduit to God in their final, agonizing moments. The Church's most powerful weapon, the ritual of prayer and sacrament, had demonstrably failed. People watched as devout nuns and holy monks, people supposedly closest to God, died screaming in their cloisters just like everyone else. Cathedrals stood empty, not by choice, but because there was no one left to lead the Mass. The institutional framework of salvation itself seemed to be crumbling. If the prayers of the Church could not stop this, then what was the Church for? This was not just a logistical crisis, it was a theological earthquake. For centuries, the Church had positioned itself as the sole, essential intermediary between humanity and the divine. Its rituals were the machinery of grace. Now that machinery had broken down in full view of a traumatized populace, the authority of the priesthood, built on the promise of spiritual protection, evaporated overnight. In the vacuum of power and explanation, people began to seek answers elsewhere. They turned inward, or they turned to new, radical voices. This gave rise to a wildfire of heterodox beliefs, movements that rejected the broken institution in favor of a direct, personal experience of God. One such movement was the Brethren of the Free Spirit, a loose network of mystics who believed that through extreme poverty and meditation, an individual could achieve a state of perfection on earth, becoming so united with God that they were beyond sin and beyond the need for the church sacraments. For them, the plague had proven the old paths were dead ends. Salvation was now a solo journey of the Spirit. Similarly, in England, the ideas of John Wycliffe and his Lollard followers began to gain traction in the decades after the plague. They argued that the Bible, not the Pope, was the ultimate authority, and that every person should be able to read it in their own language to forge their own relationship with God. This was a direct result of the spiritual hunger left by the plague years, a demand for unmediated access to the divine, a personal gnosis. The Church, reeling and weakened, responded with fierce persecution, branding these movements as heresy and burning their leaders. But the genie was out of the bottle. The Black Death had done more than kill priests. It had shattered the monopoly on faith. It planted a seed of radical individualism in spiritual matters, a conviction that the soul's journey might not require a priest, a cathedral, or even a pope. This deep, structural crack in the foundation of Christendom would quietly widen for over a century and a half, until a German monk named Martin Luther would tap into that very same disillusionment and nail his protests to a church door, unleashing the Reformation. The plague did not cause the Reformation, but it created the conditions, the profound crisis of authority and the desperate hunger for a truer, more personal faith that made such a revolution in thought not just possible, but inevitable. While the Church preached penance and scholars charted the stars, ordinary people in their plague-stricken homes turned to a more immediate magic. Beneath the surface of official religion thrived a deep, old current of practical occultism, a toolkit for spiritual survival wielded by those who could not afford to wait for heavenly mercy. This was the domain of the cunning folk, the wise women, and the village charmers who became the plague doctors of the soul. Their methods were not about grand theology, but about creating a bubble of safety in a world where the very air was thought to be cursed. One of the most famous charms against the plague was the abracadabra amulet. This was not a child's magic word, but a precise, written spell. A sufferer or a worried family would inscribe the word on a piece of parchment in a specific, tapering triangular form. It would start with the full word abracadabra on the first line, then on the next line, remove the last letter, writing abracadabra, and so on until only a single remained. This shrinking triangle was believed to trap and diminish the power of the disease, symbolically shrinking the fever and the swelling just as the word itself shrank. The parchment would be folded, placed in a linen bag, and worn around the neck for 9 days before being thrown backward into a stream flowing eastward at sunrise, carrying the sickness away. The ritual's every detail mattered: the number of days, the direction of the water, the act of casting it away without looking back. This was sympathetic magic in its purest form, using a symbolic representation to influence reality. But amulets came in many forms. People wore rings set with stones like sapphire or amber, believed to have inherent protective virtues. They carried little bags filled with a pungent mix of herbs, not just for their smell against miasma, but for their astrological correspondences, plants ruled by Jupiter for protection or by the sun for vitality. Some sewed strange symbols like the hexagram or intricate knotwork into their clothing, creating a permanent shield woven into the fabric of their daily lives. These practices were not idle superstition, they were active, defensive technologies for a world at war with invisible forces. When these homemade defenses failed, people sought out the local cunning person. These figures, often women, were the guardians of folk knowledge. They were part herbalist, part psychologist, and part priestess of a forgotten tradition. A wise woman might prescribe a plague remedy of powdered unicorn horn, which was almost always ground narwhal tusk or ivory, an exotic substance whose rarity and purity were thought to counteract corruption. More practically, she would know which local plants could reduce fever or ease pain, blending physical treatment with spiritual intention. Her true power, however, lay in diagnosis. While the church saw the plague as divine punishment for sin, the cunning folk often saw it as something else: a curse, a bewitchment, or an attack by malicious spirits. They would perform rituals of divination, perhaps dripping wax into water or reading the patterns of thrown beans, to determine if a particular illness was natural or supernatural in origin. If it was deemed a spiritual attack, they would craft a countercharm, a more potent, personalized version of the abracadabra triangle. This created a parallel system of healing that directly competed with the church. Where a priest offered confession and last rites to prepare the soul for the next world, the cunning folk offered spells and amulets to protect the body in this one. The church officially condemned these practices as witchcraft and diabolical pacts, but its condemnation often rang hollow in villages where the priest was dead, and the wise woman was the only one left who claimed to have any answers. This grassroots occultism reveals a profound truth about the plague years. When faced with an incomprehensible catastrophe, human instinct is not to submit, but to fight back with every tool available, whether blessed by a pope or whispered by grandmother. It was a quiet, stubborn rebellion of practical magic against a reality that had ceased to make any sense. The desperate search for a cure conjured its own haunting icon, a figure that now stands as the ultimate symbol of the plague doctor. Cloaked head to toe in waxed leather, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and gripping a long rod, his most terrifying feature was the mask, a leather face with round glass eyepieces and a long, grotesque beak. This was not a costume of horror, but a suit of armor designed by reason, built upon the best scientific theory of the age. The beak was the key. It was not empty. Physicians stuffed it with a dense cake of aromatic herbs and flowers, things like rose petals, cloves, myrrh, and most importantly, dried straw. The idea was pure miasma theory, the belief that plague traveled through foul air. The doctor, by breathing through this fragrant filter, would purify the poisoned atmosphere before it reached his lungs. The herbs were not random. They were chosen for their strong, sweet scents, qualities believed to counteract the stench of death and disease. The long leather coat, gloves, and boots were a physical barrier not against microscopic bacteria, but against the corrupted ether they believed clung to the sick and the dead. Even the rod he carried served a purpose: to examine patients or adjust bedding without direct touch, to maintain a sacred distance from the source of corruption. In this light, the plague doctor was an alchemist of the body, a walking ritual. His costume was a meticulously designed talisman, a full-body amulet that transformed the wearer into a purified vessel, immune to the spiritual poison saturating the world. He was humanity's logical, rationalized answer to the irrational horror, a figure of science as it was then understood, yet the reality behind the mask was often far less noble. With so many trained physicians dead or fleeing, the role was frequently filled by desperate second-raters, opportunistic charlatans, or even convicted criminals offered a pardon to do the grisly work. These men had no real medical training. Their treatments, when they dared offer any, were brutal and useless, from lancing buboes with unsterilized knives to applying poultices of human feces. For many communities, the arrival of the plague doctor, that ominous bird-like silhouette at the door, was not a sign of hope, but a death sentence. He was the herald of the inevitable, the man who came not to cure, but to confirm your fate and to mark your door. This is the profound duality of the symbol. Intended as a guardian in a suit of purified reason, he became, in the public imagination, a psychopomp, a guide for the dying, a human-shaped embodiment of the death from the dance macabre. The plague doctor stands at the crossroads of the entire crisis, where learned astrology met street-level magic, where the desperate performance of science became its own kind of macabre theater. He represents the tragic, heroic, and utterly futile attempt to build a logical fortress against a storm that was blowing through walls no one could even see. Chaos is a ladder, and the plague built a tower that reached the heavens. In the shattered world left behind, a dangerous question began to whisper among the survivors. Could anyone have been prepared? Could anyone have even benefited from this? This leads us into the shadowy realm of hidden histories, where the line between conspiracy and plausible secrecy blurs. While no evidence suggests anyone caused the plague, the unprecedented collapse of social order presented a once-in-a-millennium opportunity. Certain clandestine groups, already operating on the fringes, found the crumbling of church and state authority to be the perfect opening for their long-suppressed beliefs. Take the Brethren of the Free Spirit, the mystics who believed they could achieve divine perfection on earth. In a time when priests were dying in droves and sacraments seemed powerless, their radical message of a direct, unmediated connection to God became dangerously attractive. The plague proved their central point: the old intermediaries had failed. In the resulting spiritual vacuum, these groups could operate more freely, recruiting from the disillusioned and the desperate, gathering in hidden cells to practice their ecstatic rituals beyond the reach of a crippled inquisition. Their goal was not political power in a conventional sense, but something more profound: the spiritual transformation of humanity, starting with a small, perfected elect. The chaos was their catalyst. Beyond these heretical movements, rumors have always swirled about more secretive custodians of knowledge. Isolated monasteries, particularly those of the Benedictine order with their strict rule of self-sufficiency, cleanliness, and herbal medicine, sometimes fared noticeably better. While this was likely due to practical factors like isolation, good wells, and disciplined hygiene, it fueled legends. Stories persisted of remote abbeys where ancient texts on healing and sanitation, preserved from Greco-Roman or even older traditions, were secretly studied. Did these monks understand the principle of quarantine before it was widely adopted? Did their herb gardens contain protections beyond mere folklore? In the public imagination, their survival seemed like more than luck. It looked like hidden wisdom. Similarly, the figure of the alchemist takes on a new dimension. While most were seeking spiritual gold through their elaborate experiments, their practical work demanded a deep understanding of substances, distillation, and purification. An alchemist working in a clean, fire-sterilized laboratory who understood the virtues of certain antiseptic compounds like vinegar or alcohol and who practiced rigorous personal cleanliness as part of his ritual purity might have unwittingly created a microenvironment hostile to the plague. His survival amid so much death would have appeared miraculous or diabolical. It is not a great leap to think that such individuals, or small, secretive orders built around such knowledge, might have seen the catastrophe as a horrific but necessary purge, a planetary scale alchemical putrefaction from which a new, purified world would emerge. They wouldn't have manipulated the disease, but they may have been waiting for its consequences, ready to plant their seeds in the freshly scorched earth of medieval belief. This is the most haunting speculation of all, that within the overwhelming tragedy, there were those who watched the old world burn, not with horror, but with a cold, secret hope for the phoenix they believed must rise from its ashes. This was the world's darkest night, a blackening so complete it had a name in the secret language of the adepts, Negrito. In alchemy, the great work of transforming base matter into spiritual gold did not begin with light, but with profound darkness. The first essential stage was Negrito, the blackening, a state of putrefaction, death, and dissolution. The raw material, whether lead in a crucible or the soul of an initiate, had to be utterly broken down, its old form corrupted and rotted away before any rebirth was possible. For the true alchemist, this was not a disaster, it was the necessary first step. Now, step back and see the 14th century through that lens. The entire plague era was a planetary scale Negrito. The blackened buboes on the skin, the dark splotches of septicemia, the black smoke from burning corpses and pyres of the accused, the black robes of the mourning, the black despair in the hearts of the survivors, this was not mere coincidence of color. It was the signature of the process. Society itself was the base metal in the crucible. Its old structures, its blind faith, its rigid hierarchies, were the impurities being burned and putrefied by the heat of unbearable suffering. The alchemist watching from a secluded workshop would have seen the horror, but also the grim, sacred pattern. The famine that preceded the plague was the initial heating, the breaking down of the physical world. The war was the stirring of the volatile elements, creating chaos. Then came the plague itself, the true agent of putrefaction, reducing the vibrant, noisy medieval world to a silent, rotting mass. From an esoteric standpoint, this was a brutal but divinely ordained purification. The old world, with its corrupt church, its violent nobility, and its spiritually complacent populace, was too dense, too impure to ascend. It had to die so something new could be born. The alchemical texts are clear: you cannot get to the next stage, albedo, the whitening and purification, without first passing through the absolute blackness of Negrito. The flagellants, in their bloody self-punishment, were unconsciously acting out this very principle, trying to accelerate the putrefaction of their own sinful flesh to reach purity. The dance macabre was the art of this global Negrito, graphically depicting the dissolution of all worldly identity. Even the frantic search for scapegoats was a twisted reflection of the process, an attempt to isolate and expel the perceived corrupting element from the body of society. For those who understood the symbols, the plague was not a meaningless tragedy, it was a cosmic operation. The death of millions was the putrefactio of humanity on a mass scale, a terrible but essential cleansing of the spiritual ether. And just as the alchemist waits patiently in the darkness of his laboratory for the first sign of white to appear in the blackened matter, so too would these hidden observers have looked for the signs of albedo, the whitening, the dawn after the long night. They would have watched for the first green shoots of new thought pushing through the scorched earth, for the slow turning from collective despair to individual inquiry, for the cleansing of old, stagnant institutions. The nightmare of the Black Death in this secret history was the painful and necessary labor pains of the modern world. The long night of the plague did eventually break, but the dawn revealed a different world. One of the most profound and lasting shifts was not in politics or economics, but in the very architecture of the human spirit. The collective medieval mind, which saw itself as part of an unchanging chain from serf to king to god, had been shattered. In its place, something new and fragile began to stir, the modern sense of the individual self, when the institutions that were supposed to protect your body and save your soul collapsed around you. You were thrown back, utterly alone, onto your own spiritual resources. You could no longer rely on a priest who was dead, a lord who had fled, or a church whose rituals had demonstrably failed. Your relationship with mortality, with God, with meaning itself, became a private affair. This was a massive, traumatic evolution in consciousness, a forced awakening to self-reliance born from unimaginable loss. We can see this inward turn most clearly in the surge of personal piety that followed the plague. It was less about grand cathedrals and more about the quiet corner of a home. People began investing in small, personal devotional objects like miniature altar pieces or painted prayer books called books of hours. These were not for public show, they were for private contemplation. A merchant or even a prosperous farmer would commission one, and within its pages, they would follow the liturgical hours of the day through personalized prayers and vivid illustrations of saints and scenes from the Bible. This practice created a portable, intimate church, a direct and unmediated channel for communication with the divine that you could hold in your hands. The very act of owning and using such a book signaled a shift. Salvation was becoming a personal project. This movement toward the internal found its most eloquent voice in mystical texts that emerged from the chaos. In England, an anonymous author penned a profound guide called The Cloud of Unknowing. This was not a theological treatise for scholars, it was a manual for the solitary seeker. Its core teaching was radical. It argued that intellectual knowledge of God was impossible. Instead, the soul must reach for the divine through a cloud of forgetting for all worldly things and a cloud of unknowing for all intellectual concepts. The path was one of love, of a direct, wordless yearning of the heart. The author instructed the reader to choose a short, simple word like love or God, and to repeat it silently, using it as a spear to pierce the cloud that separated them from the divine essence. This was spirituality stripped bare of institution, ritual, and even complex thought. It was a technology for the individual soul in crisis, a method for finding God in the silence left after the screams had faded. The plague had created the perfect conditions for this. When external reality becomes a horror show, the only sane retreat is inward. The failure of collective structures forced people to build an internal fortress of faith. This was the true albedo, the whitening after the blackening. From the putrefaction of the old communal certainty arose a purified, more personal form of seeking. It was not a cheerful individualism of self-expression, but a solemn, weighty one born from staring into the abyss and realizing that, in the end, you faced it alone. This internalization changed everything. It planted the seed for the Renaissance focus on human potential and perspective. It created the audience that would later crave translated Bibles during the Reformation, wanting to read and interpret Scripture for themselves. The plague, in its brutal efficiency, had performed a kind of spiritual surgery, cutting the umbilical cord that tied the individual consciousness entirely to the collective body of the Church. The patient survived, but they would forever walk with a different gait, carrying the burden and the power of their own solitary soul. This newfound sense of self had a price tag, and it was written in silver. While souls turned inward, a revolution of flesh and coin was reshaping the landscape. The plague had performed a grim arithmetic, removing between 30 and 50% of Europe's population in just a few years. For the lords and nobles who owned the land, this was an economic catastrophe. Their manors were vast, silent, and untended. Fields lay fallow, harvests rotted. But for the surviving peasant, the serf bound to that land, this catastrophe was an unprecedented opportunity. The ancient, ironclad formula of feudalism was breaking. That formula was simple: you work my land, you give me a share of your crop and your labor, and I, your lord, provide protection and justice. It was a spiritual and economic contract, a fixed order believed to be ordained by God. Now, with workers so scarce, the bargaining power shifted violently. A serf could look at his lord's empty fields and make a demand. Why should I work your Demosne land for free, as my bondage requires, when the farmer down the valley is offering hard coin for a day's labor? The old form was dissolving. In England, the Crown tried to freeze time with the Statute of Labourers in 1351, a law that attempted to cap wages at pre-plague levels and force workers to accept old jobs. It was utterly unenforceable. The market, driven by the stark logic of supply and demand, proved stronger than royal decree. Serfs began to flee their manors in droves, heading to towns or to other lords who would pay them in cash. To keep workers, lords had no choice but to convert labor obligations into money rents. Instead of owing 3 days a week of work, a peasant could now pay a set fee and focus on his own plot or seek paid work elsewhere. This was a seismic shift. For the first time, labor was becoming a commodity, its values set by negotiation, not by divine right custom. The peasant was evolving into a tenant farmer, or even a landowner himself, as some lords sold off parcels of land just to generate income. In the towns, guilds also struggled as masters died, allowing journeymen to demand higher wages and challenging the rigid hierarchies of their crafts. This whole tumultuous process was economic alchemy in its rawest form. Feudalism was the base metal, a rigid, leaden structure where everyone's place was fixed from birth. The plague was the intense, purifying fire of the alchemical furnace. It burned away the human fuel that made the old system work, reducing it to a chaotic, molten state. From that chaotic liquidity, a new form began to crystallize, a mercury-like fluid system based on movable wealth, contractual agreements, and the value of individual labor, early capitalism. This wasn't a planned reform, it was an emergent property of survival. The collective, land-based soul of medieval society was fragmenting into a constellation of individual economic actors. A man's worth was slowly ceasing to be defined by whose land he was born on, and beginning to be defined by what he could do and what he could earn. This material transformation mirrored the spiritual one perfectly. Just as the individual was now responsible for the fate of their own soul through personal piety, they were now also responsible for the fate of their own belly through personal negotiation. The inner journey and the outer struggle were two sides of the same coin, freshly minted in the fires of the Great Dying. The world had been stripped down to its essentials, and in that bare state, a new kind of power was discovered, not the power of lineage, but the power of leverage. This celebration of the individual was not just spiritual or economic, it was about to become spectacularly visible. The wealth that now flowed into the hands of merchants, bankers, and even skilled artisans did not simply sit in coffers, it sought expression. And in the cities of Italy, especially Florence, this new money found its purpose, not in building castles for old lords, but in commissioning beauty for its own sake. The same merchant who pored over his personal book of hours in private would, in public, pay an artist to paint a scene not of a saint, but of his own family, capturing their unique faces and worldly success. Patronage shifted from the exclusive domain of the church to the open market of ambitious men. This was the fertile soil from which the Renaissance sprang. The old feudal obligations that once funneled all surplus wealth upward to a lord were gone, replaced by contracts and cash. A banker like the Medici family could now choose to fund a philosopher to translate lost Greek texts, or a sculptor to carve a David that celebrated human strength and beauty rather than a stern apostle. The plague, by obliterating so much of the old world, had cleared the intellectual and financial underbrush. The rigid dogmas that had governed thought for centuries were now questioned by men who had seen those dogmas fail catastrophically. If the church could not stop the dying, what else might it be wrong about? This created a vacuum of authority, a space of terrifying freedom where new ideas could take root. The very obsession with death, the memento mori of the danse macabre, underwent a profound alchemical transformation. When you are forced to remember you must die, it leads to one of two reactions: paralyzing fear or a fierce determination to live. In the generations that survived the plague, the latter took hold. The sentiment slowly turned from remember you must die to a defiant and beautiful seize the day. If life is fleeting and fragile, then it must be lived with intensity, with curiosity, and with appreciation for its sensory splendor. We see this pivot in the art itself. Compare a typical medieval painting with its flat, gold leaf backgrounds and stylized, symbolic figures meant to represent holy ideas to a Renaissance work by Botticelli or Leonardo. Suddenly, the background is a real, breathable landscape. The figures have weight, muscle, and individual emotion. They inhabit a world of palpable light and shadow. The subject matter expands from purely biblical scenes to include Greek myths, portraits of living people, and studies of the natural world. This was not a rejection of the spiritual, but a relocation of it. The divine was now seen as immanent, reflected in the perfect proportions of the human body, in the laws of perspective that ordered space, and in the intricate details of a flower. The scientist and the artist were often the same person because the drive was the same: to understand and to celebrate the mechanics of God's creation through direct observation, not through received doctrine. The horrific collective negrito of the plague had, against all odds, prepared the ground for this rebirth. It shattered the old containers of thought, freed up capital, and instilled a generation with the visceral understanding that time was precious and authority was fallible. The Renaissance did not happen because of the plague, but it could not have happened in the way it did without the profound, world-altering shock that the Black Death delivered. The flowering required the fire, but what about the places that seemed to stand untouched? While the plague ravaged city after city, strange pockets of survival emerged, islands of calm in a sea of death. The most famous is the English village of Eyam in Derbyshire. In 1665, a bundle of flea-infested cloth arrived from London, carrying the bubonic plague into the community. The villagers, led by their rector, made a breathtaking collective decision. They chose to quarantine themselves entirely, cutting off all contact with the outside world to prevent the disease from spreading to neighboring towns. They established a boundary marked by stones, and for over a year, they lived and died within it, losing over 260 souls from a population of around 350. Yet, crucially, the plague did not leap the boundary. Their sacrifice contained it. From a purely epidemiological view, this is a stark lesson in isolation. But folklore and esoteric tradition weave a different thread into the story. They point not just to the villagers' courage, but to the land itself. Eyam is situated in a region rich with ancient stone circles, like Arbor Low, and is crisscrossed by what dowsers and geomancers call ley lines. These are said to be invisible lines of energy coursing through the earth, connecting sacred sites like a planetary nervous system. The theory suggests that places sitting on powerful nodes of this energy, or those with a long history of positive spiritual use, might possess a kind of natural resilience. Was Eyam's survival and the containment of its horror aided by an unseen geomantic barrier? The idea extends beyond one village. Certain remote monasteries, like the Carthusian Charterhouse of La Grande Chartreuse in the French Alps, reported remarkably low death rates. Official history credits their strict isolation and superior hygiene, yet esoteric thought adds another layer. These monasteries were often deliberately built in locations considered spiritually potent by pre-Christian traditions, places with strong springs, unusual rock formations, or breathtaking vistas that inspire awe. The monks didn't just build anywhere, they sought out loci, places felt to be closer to God. This practice, known as geomancy, is the art of reading the landscape's subtle energies to find the most harmonious and protective spot for construction. A geomancer might have chosen a site where the Earth's vital force, what some call telluric currents, was particularly strong and positive. The result, in theory, was a building that wasn't just a physical shelter, but a tuned resonator of beneficial energy. Could such a place, through the focused prayer and intention of its inhabitants over centuries, have created a sort of spiritual sanitarium, a zone where the corrupted aether of the plague found it difficult to take root? This blends landscape magic with epidemiology in a fascinating way. It proposes that the land itself has an immune system, a vitality that can be enhanced or depleted by human activity. A place of constant fear, violence, and negative emotion might, in this model, become spiritually stagnant or toxic, a welcoming ground for miasma. Conversely, a location dedicated for generations to peace, contemplation, and reverence might build up a reservoir of positive resonance, a geomantic antibody. The spared villages and monasteries might have been living on land that was, in a very real sense, spiritually healthy. Their survival wasn't magic in the wand-waving sense, but a function of a deeper ecological balance between human consciousness and the living earth. It suggests that the plague was not just a test of bodies, but a test of places, revealing which parts of the world had retained their sacred integrity. The shadow never truly left. The Black Death of the 14th century was the most devastating chapter, but it was not the final one. The plague became a permanent, if dormant, resident of Europe, flaring up in terrifying waves for the next 300 years. In 1665, as the villagers of Im made their sacrifice, London was engulfed by its own catastrophe, the Great Plague. It was a grim echo of the first outbreak, killing roughly 100,000 people, a quarter of the city's population. The symptoms were the same: the buboes, the fever, the rapid decay. The responses were hauntingly familiar: the flight of the wealthy, the quarantining of houses marked with a red cross, the frantic burning of fires in the streets to cleanse the air. The same miasma theory prevailed, the same astrological searches for cause, the same desperate amulets and prayers. It was as if history had stuttered, replaying a nightmare the world had sworn to forget. Outbreaks continued to erupt sporadically across the continent, a slow-burning fuse of pestilence that kept the collective memory of the abyss painfully fresh. This pattern of return forces a deeper question: was this merely bad luck and poor sanitation, or was something more rhythmic at work? From an esoteric perspective, these recurring plagues point to a cyclical theory of history, a belief that civilizations, like individuals, undergo spiritual cycles of growth, decay, and necessary cleansing. In this view, a plague is not a random microbial event, but the manifestation of a collective shadow. Think of a civilization as a living organism. As it grows, it can become arrogant, rigid, or corrupt, accumulating what might be called spiritual toxins: greed, oppression, a disconnect from natural law, a stagnation of the collective soul. These imbalances build up in the subtle body of the culture, much like an imbalance of humors was once thought to sicken a person. When the corruption reaches a critical mass, when the civilization is too far out of alignment with the natural and spiritual order, a corrective force emerges. This force is the shadow made visible. It is not a punishment from an angry god, but a brutal, automatic rebalancing, a fever meant to burn out the infection. The plague in this cyclical model is that fever. It is a reset mechanism for a society that has lost its way. The horrific mortality is the physical correlate of a necessary spiritual purge. The Black Death arrived when medieval Europe was spiritually strained by famine, war, and a church many saw as corrupt. The Great Plague of London struck a city that had just endured a brutal civil war and was expanding into a mercantile empire with stark new inequalities. Each major outbreak seemed to coincide with a peak of social tension, moral panic, or environmental stress. From this vantage point, the flagellants beating themselves in the town square were not just fanatics. They were unconsciously acting out the very principle of the corrective, trying to initiate the purge on a small, ritual scale to avert the larger, catastrophic one. The recurring shadow, then, is a kind of terrible teacher. Its lesson is one of limits and balance. It asks, what have we forgotten? What natural law have we violated? What aspect of our shared humanity have we suppressed until it returns as physical rot? The plague cycle suggests that when a culture ignores these questions for too long, the universe itself, through the blind, impartial mechanics of biology and ecology, poses them in the most visceral way possible. The shadow returns not out of malice, but because a system too long out of balance will inevitably crash. This cyclical view transforms the plague from a historical tragedy into a recurring metaphysical event, a dark mirror held up to civilization itself, asking us, even now, what imbalances we are accumulating and what price the future might pay for our forgetfulness. The patterns are still with us, written deep in the human script. When the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the globe, it did not bring buboes or medieval miasma, but it did trigger something eerily familiar, a replay of ancient psychic software. We witnessed in real time the same archetypal responses that unfolded in the 14th century because the threat was the same, an invisible biological force that upended normal life and forced a confrontation with our own fragility. This is not to compare death tolls or pathogens, but to recognize that the Black Death established a primordial template, a set of deep psychological and spiritual patterns that activate whenever a society faces an existential biological threat. The first and most distressing echo was the search for a scapegoat. Just as medieval communities blamed Jews for poisoning wells, modern waves of fear and misinformation targeted specific groups. Asian communities faced violent attacks and were wrongly accused of creating or spreading the virus. The impulse was identical: to personify a faceless horror, to find a human agent responsible for the chaos, thereby creating an illusion of control. If we can identify and cast out the corruptor, the thinking goes, the poison will leave our world. It is the same sacrificial logic, dressed in modern clothes. Then came the explosion of alternative explanations, the new astrology and miasma theories. Official science spoke of viruses and aerosols, but parallel narratives flourished online, weaving elaborate tales about the origins of the disease. Some claimed it was a bioweapon leaked from a lab, a high-tech version of the poisoned well. Others dismissed it as a hoax or believed it was spread by 5G radio waves, a technological miasma corrupting the modern ether. These theories, however fringe, served the same purpose as the pronouncements from the University of Paris. They provided a framework, a story to explain the unexplainable, making a random, terrifying event feel intentional and therefore potentially manageable. And just as the plague shattered faith in the medieval church, COVID-19 profoundly challenged modern authorities. Governments, public health agencies, and even the scientific method itself were met with deep distrust. The failure of institutions to provide perfect, immediate answers or protection felt like a betrayal, mirroring the medieval disillusionment when priests died and prayers failed. This erosion of trust gave rise to modern flagellants of a sort, groups and individuals who embraced extreme personal rituals of purification, isolation, or defiance as their own direct path to safety, rejecting the prescribed sacraments of masks and vaccines in favor of their own chosen rites. Underneath it all pulsed the same collective memento mori. For the first time in generations, people in wealthy, modern nations were forced to collectively acknowledge mortality. The dance macabre played out on news tickers showing daily death counts. We were all reminded, rich and poor, that our plans were fragile, our bodies were vulnerable. This shared confrontation with death triggered the same alchemical pivot. For some it led to paralyzing fear. For others it sparked a profound reevaluation of life's purpose, a rush to seize the day once lockdowns lifted, a new focus on family and personal meaning. The archetype is complete: scapegoating, alternative narratives, challenges to authority, and the existential shock. The Black Death was not a one-time event, it was a revelation of a recurring human drama. It shows us that when the invisible storm hits, we do not react as 21st century people or 14th century peasants. We react as human beings, reaching for the same old tools in the psychic toolkit, tools of blame, story, rebellion, and reflection. The stage and the costumes change, but the fundamental play remains the same, a testament to the enduring patterns of fear and meaning-making that define us when the world turns strange and deadly. These archetypes did not vanish with the last fever. They went underground into the stories we tell our children. The collective trauma of the plague was too vast, too raw, to be held in official histories, so it was encoded into the secret language of folklore and fairy tales, becoming hidden memories passed down in the dark. Consider the tale of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. The classic version is simple. In 1284, a piper dressed in multicolored clothes agrees to rid the town of a rat infestation for a fee. When the town refuses to pay, he plays his pipe again, this time leading all the children away, never to be seen again. Historians have long noted the eerie date, a period of heavy German immigration to Eastern Europe. But another, more chilling interpretation whispers beneath the surface. The rats are the plague itself, the initial infestation. The piper, a mysterious stranger who arrives offering a solution, represents the unknown, the magical, or the deceptive cure that fails. His final act, leading the children away, is a perfect allegory for the plague's most devastating theft, the wholesale loss of a generation. The children do not die in the story, they simply vanish, which is exactly how it felt to survivors, an entire future, gone without a trace, led away by a force as hypnotic and inexplicable as a haunting melody. The story is not about a man and rats, it is a community's dream logic attempt to process an unprocessable loss, to give a face and a narrative to the faceless thief that emptied their homes. Then there are the countless tales of empty villages found in forests, places where the tables are set, the fires are lit, but every single soul has disappeared. These stories capture the plague's signature horror, the sudden, absolute silence. You can almost hear the echo of those real, abandoned settlements where everyone had died or fled, leaving life frozen in place. Folklore populated these voids with supernatural explanations, witches, fairies, or curses, because the truth, a random bacterium, was an unsatisfying monster. It needed a consciousness, a motive. The motif of the mysterious stranger bringing death is another plague shadow. In many European tales, a traveler in black arrives at a cottage, asks for shelter, and leaves behind a token, a coin, a piece of bread, that turns to gold or reveals itself as an omen of death. This stranger is the plague personified, an uninvited guest whose brief, neutral contact seeds destruction. The stories served a vital, esoteric purpose. They were covert training manuals for survival. Wrapped in symbolism, they passed on hard-won, terrifying knowledge. Do not trust strangers who come from afflicted regions. Do not take gifts from unknown travelers. Beware when rats flee a town, for death may follow. The message was not stated directly, it was embedded in a spell, in a narrative that would stick in the memory far better than a dry edict. This is how trauma metabolizes over centuries, not as clinical record, but as myth. The plague became the wolf in the forest, the witch in the gingerbread house, the unpayable debt to a supernatural entity. These tales are the psychological scars of a continent, told and retold until the raw pain was smoothed into a plot, a warning, a way to make the unimaginable somehow survivable in the imagination. The children who listened, wide-eyed by the fire, were not just being entertained, they were being inoculated, in a way, against a future shock, taught the old patterns of danger in a language their conscious minds might forget, but their souls would remember. But let's turn the entire story inside out for a moment. What if in 1350 a miracle happened, not a medical miracle, but a magical one? Imagine a secret conclave of the most powerful adepts in Europe, alchemists, Kabbalists, and Christian mystics, gathering in a hidden sanctuary. They pool their knowledge, performing a grand unified ritual of unprecedented scale. They channel telluric energies from sacred sites, align celestial forces through precise astrological timing, and focus the collective will of every surviving prayer group into a single, blinding point of intention. And it works. The corrupted aether is purified, the celestial miasma is dispelled, the plague vanishes overnight, as if a divine hand had wiped the slate clean. The great dying simply stops. What kind of world would have woken up the next morning? First, the Church's authority would have been not just restored, but deified. The cessation of the plague would have been hailed as a direct, undeniable answer to prayer and penitence. The flagellants would have been sanctified as prophets. The Pope would be seen as literally holding the keys to life and death. Any challenge to doctrine would be unthinkable heresy, punishable not just by fire, but by the terrifying threat of God's wrath returning. Society would likely have frozen in a permanent medieval stasis, a theocratic dictatorship where faith was enforced with absolute certainty because it had just been proven to control the very forces of nature. The profound questioning that shattered the medieval mind would never have occurred without that mass confrontation with meaningless death, without the failure of institutions. The inward turn toward personal spirituality might never have sparked. There would be no cloud of unknowing, because the cloud would have been decisively parted by the Church. Personal books of hours would remain rare luxuries, not tools for private salvation. The individual soul would remain a passive vessel, filled entirely by the institution that had saved it. Economically, the old order would snap back into place with a vengeance. With the population suddenly stable again, the lords would reclaim all their power. The bargaining leverage of the surviving peasants would evaporate. The statute of laborers would work perfectly, because why would a laborer dare challenge a system blessed by the God who just ended the plague? Serfdom would harden into a permanent condition. The fluid, cash-based economy that gave rise to the merchant class and early capitalism might have been stillborn. Wealth would stay locked in land and title, not in trade and innovation. And without this new merchant wealth-seeking prestige, the Renaissance as we know it would never ignite. Patrons like the Medici would not exist. Art would remain in service of the Church, depicting a world of perfect, unchanging hierarchy, not the vibrant, human-centered world of perspective and portraiture. The drive to understand nature through direct observation, born from the plague's lesson that old knowledge had failed, would be seen as dangerous pride. Why dissect a corpse to study anatomy when the Church has already shown you the path to eternal life? Why study the stars for natural laws when their movements are clearly instruments of divine punishment or reward? Science, as a separate, secular pursuit, might have remained a minor branch of monastic philosophy. Our modern world of individual rights, scientific inquiry, and personal expression was forged in the fire of that collective trauma. It was the breakdown of the old certainties that forced the new ways of thinking. So in this strange counterfactual, the greatest magical triumph in history would have been the ultimate curse. It would have saved millions of lives in the short term, only to imprison the human spirit in a golden, unchanging cage for centuries. The horror of the plague was, paradoxically, the price of our freedom. Its darkness was the necessary negrito that allowed for a new light to emerge. This thought experiment leaves us with a haunting reflection. Sometimes, the worst things that happen to us become the secret architects of who we are. The trauma of the plague did not dissipate, it coalesced. In the centuries that followed, as Europe rebuilt itself from the ashes, a new kind of institution began to emerge from the shadows, not a church or a guild, but a secret society. These orders, like the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons, often claimed to be guardians of an ancient, imperiled wisdom. To understand their rise, we must look back to the Great Dying, for the plague created the very conditions these societies were designed to address. The first and most profound was a catastrophic loss of knowledge. When half the population perished, it wasn't just lives that were erased, it was entire lineages of craft, oral tradition, and localized understanding. The master mason who knew the secret of a particular arch died before he could teach his apprentice. The herbalist who understood a rare plant's properties took a recipe to the grave. The scholar translating an Arabic medical text succumbed with the work half finished. This created a pervasive cultural anxiety, a haunting sense that something precious had been severed, that a golden thread of wisdom had been cut by the scythe of the pestilence. The mission to recover and preserve that lost knowledge became a sacred quest. It is no coincidence that later esoteric orders placed such supreme value on secrecy and the careful, graded initiation of members. They were building arks not for animals, but for ideas, ensuring that if another cataclysm came, the flame of this wisdom would be protected within a hidden, dedicated few, and could never be extinguished all at once. Their structures were a direct response to the plague's lesson of fragility, but the influence goes deeper than preservation. It touches core mythology. Consider the legendary founding narrative of the Rosicrucians, as told in their early 17th century manifestos. Their mythical founder, Christian Rosenkreutz, is said to have traveled to the east, to Damascus and Egypt, acquiring hidden wisdom before returning to Europe to found a secret order dedicated to the reform of science, religion, and the whole of society. His order was said to sleep in a hidden vault for 120 years before being rediscovered, its secrets intact and ready to heal a sick world. This is a perfect allegory for the post-plague experience. The journey to the East mirrors the actual path of the plague and the known repositories of ancient knowledge in the Muslim world, which had preserved Greek and Roman texts lost to Europe. The sleeping order represents the wisdom that was seemingly lost or dormant during the plague's chaos and the dark age that followed. The rediscovery and promised reformation is the Renaissance and scientific revolution, framed as an esoteric awakening. The Rosicrucian call for a universal reformation of the whole wide world reads like a direct response to the plague's indiscriminate destruction, a plan to rebuild not just cities, but the very soul of civilization on a foundation of purified, secret knowledge. They sought not to restore the old, corrupt world that had failed, but to architect a new one immune to such collapses. Freemasonry, which emerged publicly in the early 18th century, carries similar echoes. While its origins are in stone-mason guilds, its symbolic mythology is steeped in themes of death, rebirth, and the building of a spiritual temple. The central allegory of the murder of the master builder, Hiram Abiff, and the search for the lost word resonates powerfully with the plague narrative. Hiram is the master craftsman who dies before passing on the ultimate secret. The lost word is the lost knowledge. The Masonic Lodge becomes a protected space where this wisdom is ritually recovered and preserved through degrees of initiation. The plague had shown that master builders in every field could be wiped out in an instant. Freemasonry created a system to ensure the blueprint for a better world, a temple of enlightened humanity, would survive any future catastrophe. Their focus on architecture, geometry, and sacred measurement was not merely symbolic. It was a belief that rebuilding the external world correctly, according to divine principles, could prevent internal corruption and the spiritual decay that invited cosmic punishment. They were, in a sense, performing a long-term geomantic operation on civilization itself. Even the chivalric myths woven into these traditions, like the Knights Templar, gain new resonance. The Templars were destroyed in the early 14th century, just before the plague hit. Later, secret societies often claimed descent from them, portraying the Templars as martyred guardians of a sacred trust. In the aftermath of the plague, this story of a purged, pure order holding secrets too dangerous for a corrupt world would have felt profoundly true. The trauma of the plague validated the need for such hidden guardianship. It made the idea of a secret society not a paranoid fantasy, but a logical, even necessary, precaution for the survival of light in a world that had proven it could descend into absolute darkness overnight. These orders offered something the broken medieval church could not, a promise of agency. The plague had been a passive, victimizing force, but within the lodge or the brotherhood, through ritual and study, an individual could actively work on their own spiritual stone, contributing to the rebuilding of that perfect, incorruptible temple. They were giving people a tool, not to ward off the next plague with an amulet, but to build a world where such plagues, whether physical or spiritual, would find no welcoming host. The secret societies, then, can be seen as the long shadow of the pestilence, institutionalized responses to a trauma that rewrote the European psyche. They were the keepers of the flame that nearly went out, and the architects of a blueprint for a world they vowed would never burn that way again. The soil of London still holds the shape of the terror. In 2013, construction workers near the Farringdon station uncovered a mass burial pit, a plague pit from the Black Death era, containing 25 skeletons laid in neat rows. This was not a panicked dump, but a desperate, orderly response to overwhelming death. Modern archaeologists and forensic scientists now have a direct line to the 14th century. By extracting ancient DNA from the teeth of these victims, they can sequence the genome of the actual Yersinia pestis bacterium that killed them. This genetic detective work has yielded stunning results. We now know the strain that caused the Black Death was not some uniquely virulent monster. but a direct ancestor of all modern plague strains still found in rodent populations around the world. The horror was not in the germ's design, but in the perfect storm of a naive population, widespread malnutrition, and ideal conditions for transmission. The DNA evidence also disproved older theories that the plague might have been a different disease, like anthrax, confirming the historical accounts with cold, molecular certainty. Yet even hard science opens new debates. Estimates of the death toll, long cited as 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe, are being refined. Some researchers, analyzing local manorial records and wills, suggest the mortality could have been even higher in certain densely populated areas, perhaps reaching 60 or 70%. This recalibration forces us to reimagine the scale of the emptiness left behind. It wasn't just a society wounded, it was a society almost erased, with survivors walking through a world where 2 out of every 3 faces they knew were simply gone. This tangible, skeletal evidence grounds the story in physical reality, but it also deepens the mystery of the human response. We can see the bacteria, but we cannot extract the fear, the faith, or the frantic magic from the bones. That gap is where a different kind of researcher steps in. Alongside the geneticists in their labs are contemporary esoteric scholars, historians of spirituality, and practitioners of modern occult traditions who study the plague years not for pathogens, but for paradigms. They ask different questions. What can this extreme collective trauma teach us about the relationship between belief and biology? How did the medieval magical worldview, demonstrably wrong about germs, nonetheless provide a coherent, actionable framework for people to process the unprocessable? These researchers pore over the same trial records of accused witches, the same penitential manuals, and the same alchemical texts, but they read them as maps of a shattered psyche trying to reassemble reality. They see the flagellants not as madmen, but as performance artists of atonement, using the body's pain as a direct ritual technology to bargain with the divine. They analyze the abracadabra amulet not as a silly superstition, but as a precise symbolic act, a psychological weapon against helplessness. For them, the plague is the ultimate case study in how civilizations construct meaning when all meaning has collapsed. The true story of the Black Death, then, is a palimpsest, a parchment written over many times. The first layer is the biological event, now being decoded by ancient DNA. The second is the historical record of kings, laws, and death counts. The third, and most elusive, is the experiential layer, the spiritual and occult panic that was the lived reality for millions. This final layer cannot be dug up with a trowel or sequenced in a machine. It must be carefully reconstructed from the echoes left in art, folklore, and the silent architecture of trauma passed down through generations. The work is ongoing, a collaboration between the scientist carbon dating a bone and the metaphysician contemplating the dance macabre. Each discovery, whether a new strain analysis or a fresh interpretation of a witch trial, adds another piece to the mosaic. The plague reshaped history not as a single event, but as a continuing conversation between what we can prove and what we feel in our bones must be true. The bones tell one story, but the soul of the age tells another. We began with a ship carrying a microscopic bacterium, a biological fact, yet we have traveled through a landscape of astrological panic, scapegoat pyres, and self-flagellating processions, arriving at secret societies and the birth of the modern self. This has been the true story of the Black Death, an epic journey that reveals the pandemic was never merely a disease. It was a profound alchemical event on a planetary scale. The bacterium provided the spark, but the tinder was a world already strained by famine and war, and the resulting fire was a spiritual crisis that reshaped everything it touched. The plague was the great negrito, the necessary blackening. It dissolved the old, rigid forms of medieval life, the unchallenged authority of the church, the iron bonds of feudalism, the collective mind that saw itself as part of a fixed, divine chain. From that putrefaction and despair, new forms slowly crystallized. The inward turn of personal piety, the economic power of the individual laborer, the artistic explosion of the Renaissance that celebrated human beauty and perspective, all were the albedo, the whitening, that emerged from the darkness. The horror forced a fundamental rewrite of the human script, pivoting society from collective fate to individual destiny, from unquestioning faith to personal seeking. It was a transformation forged in the most terrible furnace imaginable, so we are left with a final, reflective question, one that echoes down the centuries to our own time. What shadows do we face today? What invisible crises or collective fears might be acting as our own unseen Negrito? What painful, necessary transformations are we resisting that could, however agonizingly, become the catalysts for our next renaissance? The story of the Black Death teaches us that civilizations, like souls, sometimes require a shattering to achieve a new shape. If you found this journey into the hidden layers of history compelling, please share your thoughts below. Your comments fuel these deep dives, and if you want to explore more forgotten crossroads where event and esotericism meet, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are countless more mysteries waiting to be uncovered.